In 2018, James and Brittany Campbell jetted off to the very famous Little Vegas Chapel, which is located just off the Las Vegas, Nevada Strip, and they got married by a man dressed up as Elvis Presley while the couple stood in front of a pink Cadillac. While their wedding was certainly not traditional by Western standards, it somehow seemed fitting for the newlyweds. After all, they were not a traditional couple. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was extremely energetic, outgoing, and bubbly, and she even referred to herself as being a little crazy. As for James, who was 35 years old, he was reserved and quiet, kind of analytical, and would rarely act on impulse. And on top of these two just being complete and total polar opposites, they had actually dated previously, back in high school, and it had not worked out. They had broken up and gone their separate ways, not expecting to see each other again, but nearly 2 decades later, they randomly reconnected, and this time, they had something major in common. James was a single father of 2 young boys, and he was desperately looking for a partner to not only share his life with, but someone who would come in and help him raise his kids. As for Brittany, she too was single, and she really wanted to be a mother, and so the timing of their reunion was perfect. A year after the wedding, James, who was serving in the U.S. Navy, was given orders to spend a couple of years working out of a naval base in Hawaii. So the family of 4, along with their little cat named Mr. Franklin, packed up all of their things and left the mainland of the United States, and they landed in Honolulu, which is the capital of Hawaii. The family would move into a modest 2-story home located just a couple of minutes' drive away from the airport. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in this very quiet and safe neighborhood that really didn't look like the type of neighborhood you would expect to see on a beautiful Hawaiian island. It really just kind of looked like typical American suburbs, with all these cookie-cutter 2-story houses right up next to each other on either side of the road, and out front, everyone's got a white picket fence. But for the Campbells, who had never lived in Hawaii before and were used to living on mainland America, it was actually kind of nice to move into this neighborhood and have it look kind of familiar. And so, before long, the Campbell family loved their new Hawaii house. That is, until they learned their house had a dark secret. It all started in June of 2019, so not long after the Campbells had moved to Hawaii. Brittany had to go into the garage to get something. Now, their garage was attached on the left side of their house, if you were looking at their house from the street, and there was a door on the first floor of the house that led into the garage. And so, Brittany, she walked across the first floor, she opened that door in the house, she went into the garage, she flipped on the light switch, and what she saw all over the garage made no sense to her. They still had a bunch of moving boxes that they had not unpacked, since they'd only been in Hawaii for a matter of weeks. And so all these unopened boxes, they had just kind of stacked up inside of the garage. But when Brittany had turned the lights on and looked into the garage, she saw nearly all of those boxes had been toppled over, and lots of the contents inside of these boxes had spilled out onto the ground. But even more bizarrely, it looked like it wasn't totally haphazard. It looked like someone had intentionally kind of sifted through the boxes and taken out random objects and put them into strange piles that didn't make any sense. The objects were not alike, or they had taken the objects and kind of stood them up in these strange arrangements, almost like they were being laid out for a garage sale. And so Brittany immediately just turns around and she leaves the garage, she goes to the other side of the house, and she gets her husband. She brings James back, and he looks inside, and he's just as shocked as she is, and the two of them immediately just go into the garage and begin looking through all of the stuff to see if anything is missing. Now, it was pretty difficult to tell if something had been stolen, but they did have some valuable stuff that was in those boxes that had been pulled out and was lying on the ground, and that wasn't missing. And so that was a pretty good indication to James and Brittany that this wasn't a robbery. And so the only other thing they could think of would be that their 2 young sons must have come in here and been goofing around and pulled the boxes over, and so this is their doing. But when the parents confronted the 2 young sons, they said they didn't do it. Brittany believed them, but James didn't necessarily. He thought they could be lying about it. And if they were telling the truth, then, maybe one of their pets had gotten into the garage and caused all this chaos. They had purchased a dog when they got to Hawaii, so they had a cat and a dog. And so James was just being very dismissive of this whole garage incident and not taking seriously the fact that Brittany was really spooked by this. But regardless of how the family members felt about the garage incident, they all just kind of moved on because there really wasn't anything to do except pick the garage up and continue on. About a week after the garage incident, Brittany was home alone. One morning, while getting ready, Brittany was sitting in the master bedroom in front of her mirror. She was applying eyeliner, and she had a YouTube video playing some makeup tutorials, and as she's applying the makeup, she suddenly hears the front door downstairs slam shut. She almost pokes her eye out with her eyeliner because she's so startled by the sound of it, and she immediately pauses her YouTube video and calls out for James and her sons, believing they must be home and that somebody had just slammed the door. But when she calls out, she gets no response. Now immediately, Brittany is going through all of these different rationalizations, like, okay, maybe James and the boys opened the door. They got something or put something in the house. They slammed it and they left, and so that's why they didn't hear me call their name. But she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. She's also thinking about the garage incident, which really never left her. She pretended like she had moved on, but really, she hadn't. And so, she stands up and she begins walking towards the open door that led out into the hallway. From the master bedroom, if you were looking out into the second floor hallway, it basically went straight across to another door that was her son's bedroom. And in between these two doors, basically halfway down the second floor hallway to the left, was a flight of stairs that went straight down to the first floor. And when you reached the bottom of those steps, right in front of you would be the front door, the door that had just slammed. So, Brittany reaches the threshold of the master bedroom. She's looking out into the second floor hallway, but she doesn't see anyone. So, she yells out again for James and for her sons, but again, there's silence. She takes a deep breath, and she begins walking down the second floor hallway. She makes it halfway, she turns left, and she gets onto the stairs, and as she's walking down these steps, the house is eerily quiet, and she's got this growing sense of dread inside of her. She's kind of quietly calling out for James and her sons, but it's totally quiet. When she gets to the foot of the stairs, she kind of scans around her. She doesn't see anyone, and then she walks to the front door. She flings it open, expecting, hoping to see James's car in the driveway, or just see some indication that her husband or her sons had been there, or were there. But when she opens that door, James's car is not there. There is no sign of anybody in the area. It was just her. And so, with her heart racing, she shuts the door, locks it, and then she walks all around the first floor, checking every window, checking every door, making sure everything is locked. She goes upstairs. She does the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was no one in the house with her. She was sure of it. And so, she goes back to her room, thinking to herself, what do I make of that? How do I reconcile the fact that I clearly heard the front door slam, but no one's here? Brittany would eventually leave the house and go about her day, and then that evening, she would come back home, and her husband and her sons would be there. At some point, she would bring up the slamming door to her husband to get a sense of whether that could have been him. And he would tell her that no, he had not come by the house that day, so that could not have been him. But he assured his wife, don't worry, you probably just unlocked the door, and a draft came through and slammed the door. You've got nothing to worry about. But Brittany would tell her husband that that was just not possible, that she always shut the door. She always shut and locked the door. So, the idea that she had forgotten to lock it and had left it partially ajar, enough to the point that a draft could slam it the way it did, it just didn't make any sense. But just like the garage incident, James was very dismissive and just told his wife, you're being super paranoid. You have nothing to worry about. It's just a door. Don't worry about it. But this really upset Brittany, and she got mad at James. Before long, the two were just totally fighting about it, and by the time they actually laid their heads down on their pillows that night, they weren't even speaking. So, the couple that night, they fall asleep angrily, and then In the middle of the night, Brittany wakes up suddenly. She doesn't know why she's woken up, but she's kind of looking around the room. It's totally silent, and she's trying to get her bearings. And as she's sitting there, she hears downstairs, not a slamming door, but the sound of a door opening and then shutting. Immediately, she is on heightened alert, and instead of doing anything, she just kind of leans forward and listens really intently to make sure she really heard what she thought she just heard. And as she's sitting there listening, she can hear again another door downstairs, a different door opening and then shutting. And at this point, she begins to panic. She reaches over, she shakes James awake, and she tells him, "I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs." Now, James was not remotely thrilled to be having this conversation. He was still mad at his wife for being so paranoid about the door earlier, and so to be woken up in the middle of the night to his wife freaking out about more doors being opened and shut, he was just really upset. And so, he sits up, he's totally annoyed, and he's not ready to really take seriously anything Brittany is saying. And Brittany's picking up on this, and so finally, she just says, "James, did you lock the front door before you went to bed?" And so James is like, "Yes, I locked the front door. I'm telling you, you're hearing things. There's nothing going on in this house." But Brittany was not convinced, and she says, "You know what? You can think nothing's going on, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house." And so Brittany got out of her bed, walked over to the open door that led into the second-floor hallway, and as soon as she looked out, she didn't see anything, and she didn't hear anything. And so, very slowly, she began walking down the second-floor hallway until she reached the top of the stairs. At that point, she turned and looked downstairs into the pitch-black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there to make sure her family was safe. And so, down the stairs she went. And when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she saw right away that the front door was unlocked. Brittany's thinking, "Why would my husband tell me he locked the door if it's not locked?" And so then, Brittany's thinking, "Okay, my sons must have gotten out of bed, and they must have unlocked the door. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing these doors opening and shutting because my sons are down here somewhere, and they're the ones causing all this noise." And so, Brittany kind of felt relieved for a second because this seemed like what must be going on. But after locking the front door and then searching the whole first floor, she didn't find her sons. And then, when she went upstairs again and went into her boys' room, she found both of them fast asleep in their beds. And when she shook them awake, they showed no sign of having been awake recently. They were totally groggy and could not have been running around the house just minutes earlier. And so now, Brittany is terrified. She tucks her boys back in, and she tells them, "You know, everything's fine." But then she hustles back over to the master bedroom with her husband, and she tells James, "The front door was unlocked, and our sons were fast asleep. It couldn't have been them." But James continues to be very dismissive, telling his wife, "You are totally overreacting. You're being paranoid. You're just hearing the sound of those doors because you're scared. There aren't any doors slamming in the house." And as he's saying this, their backsliding door downstairs, the one that led to their backyard, suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. And as soon as this happened, James, who had been so dismissive and totally skeptical, instantly changed. He looked at his wife, and he said, "You stay right here." And he jumped out of his bed and ran out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, he would come back into the master bedroom, and he would tell his wife, "Yeah, you know, the back door, it was unlocked, but it was shut. You know, I'm sure you just forgot to lock it. And the same draft that's opening and shutting doors, you know, probably opened and shut the back door too. So we got nothing to worry about. You know, the house is locked right now. Let's just get in bed and go to sleep." And at this, Brittany is incredulous, and she says to her husband, "You've got to be kidding me. There is something weird happening in our house. Doors are opening and shutting. We have that thing with the garage. You can't act like nothing is happening." And this, in turn, turned into a big fight. And so, before long, the parents weren't even talking about who opened and shut the doors downstairs. they were just fighting with each other. And then eventually, they were just so tired that they gave up, and they both went to sleep. For the next few weeks, nothing happened inside of the house. Brittany, though, continued to obsess over who or what had been causing those doors to open and shut, and then also, what happened in the garage. What caused all that stuff to fall out and wind up in these strange arrangements? Meanwhile, James continued to be unbelievably dismissive and did not want to talk about the potential for something strange happening in their house. But something strange would happen to just James, without Brittany around, and that would be the first time that he would get really spooked. It was a couple of weeks after the nighttime door slamming incident, and James, he was alone at his house. It's the middle of the day, and he decided he would just play the piano. And so, he moved to his piano in the living room, which is on the first floor. He sat down, and he began playing, and then, after a little while, he started to feel like he was being watched. It got to the point where it was so uncomfortable, he had to stop playing and actually look around and make sure he really was alone. And when he did that, he noticed out the window to his right, which led into the side yard, that there was clearly a figure standing in the window outside, looking in with its arms down. But there was a curtain over the window, and so all he could see was this shadow figure standing at the window. And so, James is immediately startled, and as soon as he reacted to this figure, the figure suddenly starts moving towards the back of the house. And so James, he gets up, and he rushes over to another window that looked into the backyard. He looks outside, and there's no one there. And then, he goes back to the window he originally saw the figure in. He opens it up. There's no one there. And so, James would ultimately tell himself that, okay, that must have just been some nosy neighbor that heard the music. They came over, and they noticed that maybe I saw them, and they ran off before I could see them. And so, that's what it was. But deep down, what he saw in the window really shook him up. However, it would be the blanket incident that would finally push James to go from being dismissive and skeptical to admitting to his wife, "We got a problem." It was not long after James spotted that dark figure outside of the window when he and his wife and his 2 kids decided they would head out to a movie theater to catch a movie. And so, as they're getting ready to go, Brittany would say that she wanted to bring along a particular blanket that the whole family loved to use when they were sitting on the couch. She was going to bring that blanket with her to the movie theater to kind of cuddle up under for the movie. And so she would make her way into the living room, and she would see the blanket was missing. It was not on the couch where it normally was. And so she would ask her husband and her sons if they had any idea where it was, and they would say, "No, we haven't touched it." She would look all over the place, under the couch, in the living room. She went upstairs. She couldn't find it. And so, finally, they just left without the blanket. But when they came back that evening, there on the couch, folded up neatly, was this blanket. Everybody knew that blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, the parents did their best to put on a brave face and tell their kids that everything was okay. But the parents and the kids were all terrified to be in that house, and that's because at night, the doors continued to open and shut. Their dog periodically would just start barking in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and they would all get this awful sense that they were being watched all the time in their house. And so finally, by September of that year, the parents decided, we just have to get out of this house. We cannot be here. We need to take a break. And so, they packed up their stuff and they flew to mainland America, where they stayed with some family for a week. On the 20th of September, they hopped back on a plane and they flew back to Honolulu. And as they're driving from the airport to their house, Brittany and James were just kind of secretly hoping that, whatever weirdness was happening in their house would just magically stop once they returned. But as soon as James turned onto their street and they could see their house, they knew that was not going to be the case. Because as they began driving up their road, they could see James's very nice road bike was laying on their driveway. And so Brittany, she turned to her husband, and even though she knew the answer, she said, "James, were you riding your bike before we left?" And James, who doesn't even look at his wife, just shakes his head. No, he wasn't. And so James drives all the way down the road. He turns into their driveway, which is lined up right with the front of the garage door. And after James parks the car, he hits the garage door opener button. And so, as James is sitting in the driver's seat, Brittany's right next to him. The kids are in back. They're watching as this door is raising right in front of them. And as soon as they can see into the garage, they see everything in their garage has just been completely trashed. Things are not just dumped out, but things have been ripped apart and shredded, as if a wild animal had been let loose inside of the garage. James immediately said to his wife, "We've been robbed." And then he hopped out of the car and then turned and told his kids, "You stay in the car, do not get out." And James, he went over to the side of the house and got a sledgehammer for protection and made his way to the front door. Meanwhile, Brittany would be on the phone with 911-1 to report that someone had broken into their house. A few minutes later, James was inside of his house, and he saw the entirety of his house was just like the garage. It had been completely ripped to shreds. But amidst the chaos were those kind of strange piles of random objects, much like they had seen in that first garage incident, where the things inside of the boxes had been stacked in kind of strange piles and arrangements. And so, James is looking around his first floor, and he's seeing stacks of coasters and books and electronics. But what really got James's attention was that on various surfaces, there were these medical vials of drugs or chemicals that were placed all over the place, and he knew that was not his family's. Someone had brought those vials into this house. James would make his way up the stairs to the second floor landing, and right away, he could tell, the upstairs had all the hallmarks of being destroyed as much as the first floor. But when he went left and went into his boy's room, he saw that room was pristine. In fact, it had been cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded on one side of the room. Their beds were perfectly made with military precision, and all of their toys and different things that were normally all over the floor were neatly put away in the places they should go. And so, James would turn around and leave his boy's room in absolute astonishment, and he would walk across the second floor hallway into the master bedroom. And what he would find in there would make an already terrible situation much worse. The master bedroom was destroyed, like the majority of the house and garage, except the top of their bed was not covered in junk. Instead, on their bed was this towel that had been neatly laid out, almost like a tablecloth. And laying on this towel, neatly spaced apart, kind of perfectly arranged, were a bunch of knives. And then, next to the knives, still on the towel, was a laptop that the Campbell family owned, but they didn't use it. It did work, but it just kind of sat in the master bedroom. And this laptop was sitting on this towel, and it was open, but the screen had turned off. And so, by this point, Brittany had come upstairs. And so, Brittany and James, they walk over in horror to this layout on their bed, and they click the keys on the keyboard of their laptop. And it illuminates the screen and shows whatever was being worked on last. And it's this long, long Word document that neither of them made. They scrolled to the top of this document, and the document was titled The Omnivore Trials. And then, below that, it said, A Rehabilitation for Rat-like People. And then below that, the entire document was kind of like a diary. It was a whole bunch of observations about so-called specimens, and these specimens were very clearly the Campbell family. And these observations made about the Campbell family were very intimate. In fact, the only way to garner these observations were if you were watching the Campbell family right up close, almost on an hourly basis for days, weeks, months at a time. These observations ranged from what time the Campbell family liked to watch television to what James and Brittany talked about behind closed doors in their bedroom, including their struggle to have a child, something they were not talking about to their family. But in this document, the author of The Omnivore Trials would talk about how the creature, which was referencing Brittany, needed to stop trying to have another baby and instead focus on the children she already had. Toward the end of this really lengthy document, the author of The Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. These surgeries were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries. And then, after this conclusion, There was another note that detailed all the different surgeon tools the author would need to perform these surgeries, as well as a list of drugs and chemicals they would need in order to sedate these specimens before they perform these surgeries. And so, after James and Brittany see this, they realized that those knives laying out on the towel were for them. Those were the knives that were going to be used for the surgeries. And all those weird vials, those medical vials they saw all downstairs, those were likely the drugs that would be used to sedate them so they could go under the knife. 15 minutes before James and Brittany went into their house and discovered the knives, the medical vials, and the laptop, James grabbed that sledgehammer and walked to the front door while his wife called 911-1. And so James, he gets to the front door, he puts his key into the lock, he unlocks it, and with the sledgehammer in one hand, he attempts to push the door open. But despite the door being unlocked, he can't open it. There's resistance behind the door. And so James kind of gets down, and he presses as hard as he can into the door with his shoulder until finally it opens up just a crack, and James can see into the house. And so James, as he's pressing the door barely open, he's staring into this crack trying to make out what's going on inside of his house. And then, suddenly, a set of eyes meet his from behind the door. And before James can do anything, this man that is standing inside of his house says to James, "This is not your house," and then proceeds to push the door shut on James. James, in an adrenaline-fueled fury, smashed the door open, grabbed this guy, and yanked him out of the house and threw him onto the front yard. And then James, with his sledgehammer, would stand in front of this guy, between him and his kids and his wife, and he would say, "If you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this." But the intruder, this guy whose name was Ezekiel Zayas, he was a 23-year-old young man. He would just stand on the Campbell's property, staring directly at James, unblinking. And then, a couple of minutes later, the police would show up, and Ezekiel would not put up any fight. He would be arrested and would be taken away. It was after he was gone that James and his wife would actually go into their house, and they would see the state it was in, and they would go upstairs, and they would discover the knives and the laptop. It would turn out, months earlier, Ezekiel had apparently found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbell's property. And so, around the time they had moved in, Ezekiel was living there as well. He was mostly living in the crawl space above the second-floor bathroom, and then, whenever he was able to, Ezekiel would climb down out of this crawl space, and he would go and observe the Campbells. And this was not just at night. Based on some of the observations inside of Ezekiel's Omnivore Trials document, clearly he was watching the family in the middle of the day too. Also, based on these observations in this document, it was pretty clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to actually carry out these surgeries on the Campbell family, meaning the Campbells' decision to go on vacation when they did could very well have saved their lives. And if there was any question as to whether Ezekiel could have actually carried out that level of physical harm on another human being by carrying out those surgeries well, after he was arrested for what he did to the Campbells, while he was in jail, he beat his cellmate to death. Allegedly, although a guard literally walked in and saw Ezekiel punching and kicking and beating this guy, and then he died. But technically, the trial is not over, so it's allegedly. Ezekiel is currently in a state hospital, and they are trying to determine if he is fit to stand trial for what he did to the Campbells and for what he did to his cellmate, even though it might be self-explanatory at this point in the video. It's worth pointing out that we have no idea what Ezekiel's motives were for why he did the things he did to the Campbell family, or what he was looking to achieve with the so-called Omnivore Trials. We also don't know why he allegedly killed his cellmate. As for the Campbells, this whole experience was so traumatic that they did not stay at their Hawaii house. They moved, and as of today, their whereabouts are unknown. The crime that would eventually put Timothy Evans on death row was horrific. But when you take a look at Timothy Evans's past, it's not really a shocker that his life played out the way that it did. Before Timothy was even born, in 1924, in the southern end of Wales, his father had abandoned him and his siblings and his mother. And because Timothy's mother made almost no money when Timothy was born, He was effectively born into poverty. As a young child, Timothy really struggled to learn how to speak properly. And then in school, he just really struggled to keep up with his peers. To make matters worse, when Timothy was 8 years old, he contracted tuberculosis of the skin on the underside of his right foot. This condition is not necessarily fatal, but it causes these large, painful blisters that take a really long time to go away, even with treatment. And because Timothy's outbreak was on the underside of his foot, it made walking nearly impossible. And so, for a few years, starting when he was 8 years old and he was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the skin, Timothy had to miss huge chunks of his schooling to get medical treatment. And then, other times, he was missing school simply because he couldn't walk. Considering how poorly Timothy was already doing in school, these huge extended absences were totally catastrophic for his education. In fact, later in life, it would be determined that Timothy's IQ, which is a way to measure people's intelligence, was somewhere between 60 and 70, which is very low and put him in the range of having an intellectual disability. Not long after his tuberculosis of the skin diagnosis, Timothy would remain in school despite all of these absences and despite how difficult it was for him. But his real focus would shift from getting an education to trying to find work in order to help provide for his family, who were very poor. And Timothy was willing to do just about anything for money. For example, when he was only 13 years old, he became a coal miner, one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet at the time and still today. But despite Timothy's willingness to do these really challenging jobs that often paid very little, he would always eventually get fired, or he just would not get the job in the first place. He would be rejected, and always it was because either, 1, he had a flare-up of his tuberculosis on his foot, which made it impossible to walk and so he couldn't go to and from his job, and so he'd be let go, or it would be because of his illiteracy, and the job just could not take someone in that could not read, write, or really even speak very well. Or, in some cases, like when Timothy tried to join the military when he was 18 years old, and World War II was raging, and all of his peers were going off to fight the war. Well, when he tried to enlist, the military said, "You know, we can't take you because you are illiterate and because of your foot." This constant cycle of rejection and embarrassment really made Timothy quite cynical. He felt like he just didn't belong anywhere. And so, at some point, perhaps as a coping mechanism, Timothy began to lie. He'd make up tall tales about the adventures he'd been on, all the influential people he knew, and the superhuman skills he possessed. Now, most people who knew Timothy didn't believe any of the stories he told, but every now and again, some people actually did. And for Timothy, that little sliver of respect he would get in that moment, even though it was built on a lie, on an illusion, it was incredible for him. He didn't get that anywhere else in his life, and so he kind of became addicted to telling these lies. Fast forward to 1947, Timothy was 23 years old, and he was still living with his family, who had left Wales and had moved to London, and they were living in a very, very poor and dangerous neighborhood. At the time, Timothy had managed to get a job as a delivery driver and had yet to be fired from it. And on one of his daily routes around the city, he wound up meeting an 18-year-old girl named Beryl Thorley, who he really took a liking to. Now, according to people who knew Beryl, she apparently, like Timothy, had a very low IQ. And so Beryl and Timothy, they meet on one of Timothy's routes, and they immediately hit it off, and they start dating. And by the end of that year, they were married. They initially lived inside of Timothy's family's apartment, but when Beryl became pregnant in early 1948, she and Timothy pooled what little money they had, and they got an apartment of their own. Their new apartment was terrible. It was tiny. It was dirty. It was located in an even more dangerous neighborhood than where Timothy's family lived. But it was good enough for them, at least at first. Once Beryl gave birth to their daughter, Geraldine, suddenly their cramped living quarters seemed impossibly small for a family of 3, and they were already extremely tight on money. And now, adding a baby to the mix, they really just did not have enough money to survive. Timothy immediately tried picking up extra work wherever he could, But once again, his illiteracy and his foot, or a combination of the two, held him back. And so, it wasn't long before the couple was forced to start taking out these awful, high-interest loans that they knew they would never be able to pay back. So, they are permanently saddled with debt. They know it, and these loans are only enough to barely get by. This is not enough to move out. This is only enough to stay in their squalid and awful conditions. And so, as their debt piled up, in conjunction with all the stresses of being new parents and living in this really cramped space, it wasn't long before Beryl and Timothy's marriage just totally started to erode. It started with daily arguing over one of their many hardships, but it quickly escalated to full-blown physical confrontation that often was so loud that passers-by outside, in the very busy street, would hear coming from the third floor Timothy and Beryl screaming and yelling and punching each other, to the point where people outside literally stopped and just looked up, wondering what was going on up there. As Timothy's world seemed to just kind of crumble all around him, he had first turned to a coping mechanism he had used for most of his life, and that was just to lie about his current situation. He would tell people who would listen that he and his wife and his kid were doing great and everything was fine, but, behind closed doors, that wasn't true at all. And so, that coping mechanism really didn't do a lot for him. And so, Timothy eventually turned to alcohol to cope with his misery. But the alcohol would only make the situation worse, because it was yet another thing for his wife to be mad at him about, and he was depressed all the time, and it was eating away at their non-existent budget to pay for all this alcohol. And so, Timothy would turn to yet another source for comfort. But it would be a very unlikely source of comfort. It would be his downstairs neighbor, John Christie. And the reason his downstairs neighbor was so unlikely was because John could not have been more different from Timothy. John was nearly double Timothy's age. He was incredibly smart, and he was respected not only by his peers, but really by the community. And that respect came from the fact that John had served during World War I and been right on the front lines, and had nearly been killed during a mustard gas attack when he was fighting in the trenches. And then, after the war was over, John would come back to London, and he would become a police constable for quite a while. And then, after retiring from the force, he became a post office clerk. But despite John and Timothy's vast differences, there was one thing they had in common: marital problems. John and his wife, Ethel, had gotten married back in 1920, so 4 years before Timothy had even been born. But at some point early on in their marriage, the couple had split up. They didn't get divorced, but they separated, and they lived totally apart for a while. But in 1934, the couple would finally reconcile, and that's when they moved into the ground floor apartment of the apartment building that Timothy and Beryl would move into years later. So, years later, when John is sitting in his apartment, and he can hear, coming from the third floor, like everybody else in the general vicinity, the sound of Timothy and Beryl fighting like crazy up in their apartment, John decided, with his experience with reconciling with his wife, that he ought to reach out to that young man, Timothy, and offer him some advice, or, at the very least, be a friendly sounding board. And so, John would eventually strike up a conversation with Timothy one day when they were passing each other, and Timothy was at a place in his life where he was looking for friends. He didn't have any friends, and so John coming into his life at this point was really good for Timothy. And so, very quickly, those two struck up a friendship. But this friendship was not really peer-to-peer. It was more like father to son or mentor to mentee, where Timothy really looked up to John. I mean, Timothy had never had a father in his life, and so John kind of became that. And John looked at Timothy with a lot of empathy. He could tell this was a man who was, not very bright, and he was in way over his head with debt, with this marriage, with parenthood, everything. And so John tried hard to kind of coach and guide Timothy as he navigated this very rough time in his life. And their relationship likely could have had a really positive effect, not only on just Timothy's mental health, but also perhaps on the state of Timothy and Beryl's marriage. But it was not long after John met Timothy that Timothy found out Beryl was pregnant with a second child. This was terrible news for Timothy. He knew they absolutely could not afford another child. As it was, they couldn't afford the current child they had. They couldn't afford anything, and in the United Kingdom, abortions were illegal, so there was no way to terminate this pregnancy. And so, totally desperate and terrified, Timothy turned to John for guidance. And John would later recall on the witness stand during Timothy's trial that, John did his best to try to console and comfort and tell Timothy that everything was going to be okay. You'll get another job, you'll take out another loan, it'll all work out. But as John would say on the witness stand, his words didn't have any effect on Timothy. By the time he came to John, he was totally inconsolable. He was desperate, and he was unhinged. And so, John started to suspect that Timothy might do something really drastic to make his troubles go away. And John would be correct. A few weeks later, on the 30th of November, 1949, a very disheveled-looking Timothy wandered into a local police station in Wales, not far from where he had grown up, and he would confess to the police that he had killed his wife. He would tell the police that he had given Beryl a poison that was apparently designed to abort her fetus, but this poison was too strong, and it had killed Beryl. And then, after she was dead, Timothy said he panicked, and so he took her body and he dumped her down the sewer that was outside of their apartment building. And then he arranged for his daughter, Geraldine, to go stay with some people in London while Timothy fled to Wales. But after getting to Wales, Timothy said his guilty conscience was just too much, and so he turned himself in. The police immediately arrested Timothy, and they brought him back to London. And then, once he was in a cell in London, London detectives went out to Timothy's apartment building, and they went to the manhole cover that led down into the sewer that was right outside of the apartment building. And right away, they noticed something odd. They were not able to get the lid off of the sewer. It was just too heavy. It would move, but one man couldn't do it. And so, after 3 police officers, they all got down, and they were barely able to get this lid up and off of the top of the sewer. And then, when they went down into the sewer, there was no body. There was nothing down there. And so, when detectives went back to Timothy in the London jail cell, and they confronted him with this revelation that, no, she's not in there, Timothy would kind of squirm a little bit, and then he would totally change his story. He would tell police that it was not he who gave Beryl this poison that ended up killing her. It was his friend, mentor, and father-like figure in his life, John Christie. Timothy also told police that he left his daughter, Geraldine, in the care of John. Police were skeptical of Timothy, but because there's a child involved, they just immediately take his story at face value, and they rush back to the apartment building. They knock on John's door, and John opens the door, standing there with his wife, Ethel, and he's totally shocked at these accusations that have been lodged against him by who he thought was a very close friend. John and Ethel would tell police that not only did they have no clue what happened to Beryl, but Geraldine had never been in their care. And so the police are immediately very concerned for Geraldine's well-being. Who has Geraldine? Where is she? But while they were there, they just did a thorough search of John and Ethel's property to make sure they weren't lying. And then, after searching their property, there was nothing inside. But when police left John and Ethel's apartment and began searching the outside of the property, an area that they had briefly searched when they were there earlier, looking in the sewer, but now they were doing a much more thorough search. During this thorough search, they find this shed that was located in the backyard of this big apartment building. And inside of the shed, wrapped in blankets, are the bodies of Beryl and her 13-month-old daughter, Geraldine. They had both been strangled to death. After processing the crime scene, the police went back to the jail where Timothy was being held, and they would tell him what they discovered at the property. And Timothy had a very muted response to it. And then, when one of the detectives asked Timothy point blank, "Are you responsible for both your wife and your daughter's deaths?" Timothy would say, "Yes." And then, during a follow-on interrogation, Timothy would confess that he had been in a heated argument with his wife over money, and at some point during this fight, which got very physical, he strangled Beryl to death. And then, 2 days later, he strangled his daughter to death. And then, after dumping their bodies in that shed, outside, he fled to Wales. Timothy would actually recant that final confession, but it really didn't matter because when he went to trial a little over a month later, the jury just did not believe that Timothy did not do it. And so, very quickly, they convicted him of murder, and they sentenced him to death. Just 3 months after his conviction, on the 9th of March, 1950, Timothy would find himself sitting inside of the so-called condemned suite at Pentonville Prison in London. He was shackled to this table, with guards sitting on either side of him in this very small cell. And then, right next to him, was this wall that kind of ran down the side of the cell, and on the other side of that wall was the execution chamber. And so, as Timothy would have been sitting at this table, suddenly, the cell door that led into the holding area would have flung open. The execution team would have rushed in and grabbed Timothy and stood him up before he could run or fight back. And then, before he knew it, he'd be pushed over to the door that went through that wall into the execution chamber. Once that door was open, Timothy only would have had maybe a couple of seconds to take in what he saw. And it would have been this pale green square room with a noose dangling down from the ceiling, and right below it was an obvious mechanical trapdoor. And off to the side of the room was a lever that the executioner would actually pull to open up that floor and send the prisoner falling down into the pit below. And so, Timothy, he would have taken this in just for a second. His heart would have been racing, and before long, he would have been standing on this trapdoor. The noose would have come down. They would have tightened it to his neck. A bag would have been placed over his head. All the guards would have pushed to the walls. And then, before Timothy could even say or do anything, the lever was pulled, and he dropped down into a 12-foot deep brick-lined pit where he would dangle by his neck until he died. This gruesome ending should have been the end of an already very gruesome story, but it wasn't, not even close. 3 years after Timothy's execution, a man named Beresford Brown moved into the same ground floor apartment that John Christie and Ethel had shared. John had moved out just a couple of days earlier. And so, Beresford, he moves into this apartment. It's totally dirty. It's not well kept. And so Beresford decides that he's going to fix the place up. And the first thing he's going to do is he's going to tear down all of the old wallpaper in the kitchen and replace it. And so, he goes into the kitchen, he starts tearing down the wallpaper, he makes his way into the kitchen pantry, he starts pulling the wallpaper down in there, and at some point, when he pulls one strip of paper all the way to the ground, he sees, towards the bottom of this wall inside of his pantry, where there are no shelves over it, behind the wallpaper, there is obviously a door, just a small door. It almost looks like the entrance to a crawl space. And so, Beresford is totally intrigued, why would there be this door behind the wallpaper in the pantry? And so, he rips off the remaining wallpaper over this little door. He finds the handle and forces it open. And what he sees inside of that little room would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 years and 4 months earlier, when Timothy discovered that his wife, Beryl, was pregnant with their second child, Timothy really did go to his friend John for guidance. However, this is where the story takes a turn. When Tim came to John, who was medically trained from his time in the military, would tell Tim, "Hey, I can perform an abortion on Beryl if you want me to." Timothy immediately thought this was a great idea, and so, totally relieved, thinking his problems are now all solved, he left John's apartment and ran upstairs to his own. He told Beryl about how John could perform this procedure for them. Did she want to do it? And Beryl said, "Yeah, let's do it." Now, we don't know exactly what happened next, but the running theory is that sometime in November of 1949, Beryl and Geraldine left their apartment on the 3rd floor and went down to the 1st floor, John's apartment. And when they got there, it was just John. John's wife, Ethel, she was gone for the day. As for Timothy, he also was not present for this procedure, but he likely knew it was happening. So Beryl and Geraldine, they walk inside of John's apartment, and pretty quickly, Beryl finds a place, or maybe John finds a place, to put Geraldine in the apartment where she's safe. And then John ushers Beryl over to this chair. It's like his makeshift medical chair, and he tells her to have a seat. So she sits down, and John goes over and gets this device. Now, this device looks like a glass jar filled with clear liquid, and then poking out of either side of it are these black, thin, hollow tubes that come out and connect at this kind of makeshift mouthpiece. And so John, he walks over with this device, and he hands the mouthpiece portion of this device to Beryl, and he says, "Here, put this on your mouth and start breathing it in. There's a gas I produce that kind of numbs the pain as I do this procedure to you." And so Beryl did as she was told. She took this mouthpiece and she put it over her mouth and her nose, and she began breathing deeply. And as she did that, John grabbed the chemical and he began slowly pouring it into the glass jar where these tubes were coming out of. And as he did that, a white gas began to form above the liquid inside of the jar, and there was a cover over the top of this jar, so the gas was trapped inside of this jar. And as Beryl is taking these big breaths through those tubes, she's sucking that gas into her lungs. And very quickly, as she's breathing on this apparatus, she didn't start feeling numb, she just passed out completely. However, this was John's plan all along. That device he made her put on her face was only designed to make people pass out. It was not to numb any pain. John was not medically trained. He was not performing abortions out of his apartment. He was a serial killer. So, with Beryl now unconscious in front of him, John did the same thing he did to the other two women he had lured into his trap and whose bodies were now buried in his backyard. He began having his way with Beryl, and at some point during this assault, Beryl woke up and began trying to fight off John, but he overpowered her and he strangled her to death. And then, after she was dead, John just walked into the other room where Geraldine was, and he used a shirt tie and he wrapped it around Geraldine's neck, and he strangled her to death. And then, after that, he put the mother and daughter together in some sheets, and he put them out in the shed in the backyard. Later, when Timothy came to John's apartment to see how the procedure had gone on his wife, John would tell Timothy that, "Sorry, it didn't work out, and your wife is dead. Don't worry, I'll look after your daughter and make sure she's taken care of. You need to flee London and go to Wales now." And so, Timothy, without really asking any questions, would do as he was told, and he would flee to Wales. But a little while later, when he tried to check in with John about how his daughter was doing, because he had no idea where she was or who she was with, John would just not let Timothy see her. And so Timothy, eventually just feeling racked with guilt about this whole situation, he went to police. And critically, when he spoke to police, he lied about what happened. He wanted to protect his friend John, who he looked at as a father figure, as a mentor, as a close friend. And so he said, "I killed my wife." And so, this is why Timothy got the location of his wife's body wrong, because he didn't know. He just guessed the sewer. And so, that explains why, when they got over to the sewer, not only was it empty, but it seemed totally impossible that anybody could have lifted this manhole cover on their own. It was too heavy. Then, after police discovered Beryl and Geraldine's bodies, and they went back to the London jail and told Timothy, that was the first time he found out what had happened to his daughter. Because, to that point, Tim really did believe that John had just been taking care of Geraldine, or John had handed off his child to somebody else who was taking care of Geraldine. But either way, Geraldine was okay. So, he's just been told, she's not okay, she's dead as well. His whole family is gone. And so, Tim was almost certainly in shock. And so he's sitting there with that sort of muted response as detectives are asking him, "Are you responsible for your wife and your child's death?" And so Tim would say, "Yes." But it's unclear if Tim actually understood their question, or if he understood the implications of their question. He might have just been saying, "I feel guilty about the fact that my family is dead." Not that he literally killed both his wife and daughter. But when Tim finally kind of snapped out of it, and really began trying to tell the truth that John was responsible, nobody believed him, because his credibility was totally destroyed. Because the first thing he did when he went to police was lie about what happened. And when police dug into Timothy's history a little bit, they saw he was a compulsive liar. Everybody said, "Oh, Timothy tells tall tales. That's just what he does." And making things even worse for Timothy was the fact that he had a very clear motive for why he might harm his family. He was under crippling debt, and his relationship with his wife was incredibly toxic and often became physical, and there were lots of witnesses to that. During Timothy's trial, despite the fact that Timothy and his lawyers tried everything they could to point the finger at John Christie, saying, "No, he's the guy responsible," because John was constantly on the witness stand and had this impeccable resume as this war hero and this police constable, and he was well respected, and he was well spoken, and he was smart. The jury completely believed him. He was the epitome of credible, whereas Timothy was the opposite. And so, it was largely John, the real killer's testimony, that actually put Timothy, the innocent man, on death row. Also, the police totally botched the investigation from the beginning. Because the police went into the investigation already completely convinced that Timothy was guilty, this was an open and shut case, and them gathering evidence and doing all this didn't really matter because Timothy was the guy. And so, because the police were so focused on Timothy, they were blind to really obvious things all around them. For example, during their several searches of the apartment complex, both inside and out, a dog ran into the backyard and actually dug up one of the skeletons from one of those two women that John had killed years earlier and buried out there. And so, a human skull and a human leg bone were visible outside as police are walking around. John was able to grab the skull and chuck it next door into a burned-out building, but the leg bone was literally propped up against the side of the backyard in plain view. Nobody caught it. The police are also believed to have coerced Timothy into signing his final confession, where he says, "I not only killed my wife, but I also killed my daughter." There's even some speculation that the police literally signed it for him, that they forged the entire document. And so, Timothy gets hauled off and executed. Meanwhile, John, the real killer, just keeps on killing. He would murder at least 4 more women, including his wife Ethel, using the same technique, the gas machine, followed by strangulation. And it was during the time that he killed these last 4 victims that we know about, that John became increasingly turned on by death itself. And so, that was why he stuffed his wife's body right underneath the floorboards in his kitchen. And he stuffed those other 3 women inside of that tiny little room behind that secret door in the pantry, so that all day long, as he was in his apartment, it constantly smelled of decomposing flesh. After Beresford Brown opened that secret door in the kitchen pantry and discovered those 3 women's bodies smashed inside of there, he would tell the police. And then, 10 days later, on the 31st of March, 1953, John Christie would be found and arrested. He would confess to killing all 8 victims, but the police only had enough evidence to charge him with 1 murder, and that was the murder of his wife Ethel. But he was found guilty of that, and it was enough to warrant a death sentence. On the 15th of July of that year, at about 9 a.m., John Christie found himself sitting in the same condemned suite at Pentonville Prison that Timothy Evans had been sitting in 3.5 years earlier. Then, moments later, the door behind John opened up. The same execution team that killed Timothy Evans came inside. They grabbed John, they hoisted him up, they moved him over to the door that led into the execution chamber. The door flung open, and John got his first look at the gallows. They rushed him over to the middle of the room, they pulled the noose down, tied it tight around his neck. They put the bag down over his head, all the guards stepped to the side, and then, right as the executioner is about to pull down the lever, John, out of the blue, says, "Wait, my nose itches," to which the executioner just said, "It won't bother you for long." And then he pulls the switch. Due in large part to the massive injustice in this case, where an obviously innocent man was carted off and executed, the UK would suspend the death penalty in 1965, and then, in 1969, they would abolish it entirely. Between those 2 dates, in 1966, Timothy would receive a posthumous pardon for the murder of his family, meaning he is officially an innocent man. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, when the like button asks you to spray sunscreen on their back, gladly agree. But instead of sunscreen, use blue spray paint.